Recording. Now we're recording. Jolly good. And if any of you have a desire not to be seen or recorded, then just use your stop video so that you won't be seen. Right, I think that's about it, isn't it? I think that is. So Jack, are you ready to?
I'm ready, Mike. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. We have all of your bio from which have been sent out before. Jack's talk to us tonight, which is in his book here. The third talk is in fact chapter 4 of his tour book, which is called Freemasons, the Female of the Species. So would you all please mute yourself if you have not done so already, except for Jack. And Jack, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike, and apologies, guys. We need to iron out why it's such a wobbly start, but here we are. We're on the air, so to speak. This paper, when I started thinking about writing another chapter for my book, my intention was to write one about some number of Irish Freemasons, males mostly, and with one woman in it, just as a token, to talk about some woman who may or may not have been a member of Freemasons. But I became absolutely engrossed in the research material because there was such a lot of it out there that I thought to myself that I would just specialize and make it entirely about what I came to talk about, the female of the species. I did on the one other slide have the comment by Rudyard Kipling that the female of the species is more deadly than the male. But I thought there might be women listening who would want to interrogate me on that, so I took it off again. Anyway, the Albert Mackey, the well-known 19th century Masonic researcher, in his Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, acknowledged way back in the late 1800s the existence of female Freemasons. So it goes way back past the end of the 20th century and into the 19th century. The purpose of the paper is to examine some stories of female Freemasons and to describe how female Freemasons lodges have developed over the years. What you can see on your screen there are a couple of logos for female Freemasonry organizations. The one on the left, the Grande Loge Féminine de France, and the other one, Le Droit Humain. And I will be talking about those a little later. As in many things to do with Freemasonry, France has played a significant role in this particular issue. It had mixed lodges back in the 1890s, and the involvement of women in Freemasonry in some form or other goes way back before that. It spread from France to other countries, and it had initially a particular methodology, I suppose you would call it, for women engaging in lodges called adoptive Masonry. And from adoptive Masonry, we developed co-Freemasonry, and indeed women's only lodges. In medieval Europe, at the time of the building of the great cathedrals, etc., women were under the control of their fathers. And when they moved from being under the control of their fathers, they became under the control of their husbands. They didn't have very much of a legal entity in themselves where they could conduct business. But under some circumstances, women were able to engage in operative Masonry. And what you're looking at on the screen there is an image of a woman called Sabina von Steinbach. I'll come to her in a second. She's on the screen because she's the one whose image I could source. An earlier one is Gunilda of Norwich. Now, Gunilda of Norwich was a woman who was able to engage in Masonry in the 13th century. And the reason she was able to engage in Masonry is very often women whose fathers had passed away were able to get a special dispensation to engage in a particular trade. And we know that Gunilda was employed as a Mason because there is a very verifiable legal document in Norwich. It's called Calendar of Close Rolls. And the Calendar of Close Rolls was a document which often, generally, in fact, it had its source from the king. And it was a sealed document that had the official wax seal, which was stamped with an official stamp. And in that close roll is mention of Gunilda of Norwich, and it talks about her being paid to act as an operative Mason. Sabina von Steinbach, who is the image, her father was, according to the history, was the architect of Strasbourg Cathedral. And Sabina was both a sculptor, which is what she's doing in the image, and she was a Mason. She features and still features in many art books because of the sculptures which she has is meant to have produced. And Sabina, some people think that she's perhaps something of a myth. I don't think she is. Up until very recently, she was part of art courses. The problem with Sabina has been that some people in the art history world have suddenly started questioning the age of some of the sculptures which were attributed to her. In particular, there was in one of the sculptures an image of a scroll with a date and some information on it. And some people have said there may be a misinterpretation of the scroll. But like all good Masonic conspiracies, the scroll seems to have disappeared. Sharon Kidd, who's a prolific author in this particular topic, is one of the people who doesn't subscribe to the existence of Sabina, but there's plenty written about her. And I think we have to accept that she was very probably in medieval times a woman who was able to work as an operative Mason. In Carnarvon in Wales, there are some historical records by way of payment documents which show that some women were being paid as what they call rough Masons. You'll be familiar with the idea that there are Masons who do the finishing work and Masons who produce the rough work and other Masons who hew the stone from the quarries. So the women were employed as rough Masons, and there's very clear evidence in Wales and Carnarvon that these women did in fact exist. They're actually named, although what you've got to realize here is back in medieval times, names weren't common the way they are now. People lived in very small communities, so you might be called Fred, the barrel maker's son or something. And in this case, the people listed, the 4 women listed as receiving payment for working as Masons are Juliana, described as the daughter of the smith, Emota, the daughter of the smith, Elena, she must have been a little more grand, she was Elena of England, and Juliana, who was the wife of someone called Aid. And that's a verifiable document which sits in Carnarvon. Karen Kidd herself provides evidence of some women who worked as operative Masons. And she mentions that up until the 1800s, there were women who were actually employing people as Masons. Mary Simpson, who was from London, actually employed apprentices as operative Masons, including her own son. And there's also a Masonic charge in something called the York manuscript. And it's written in that oldie worldly type English. And it says, and I quote from the document, he, and he is spelled with 2 E's, he or she, spelled with 2 E's, that is to be made a Mason. And the Masonic historian, Frederick Alexander Woodford, has checked that document out, and he is of the view that it's a genuine document. Don't worry too much about the weird spelling, because spelling has been a very fluid thing throughout history in England, and that there's nothing at all unusual about that spelling. What you're looking at there is a meeting of both of the orders of female Masons who meet in London. I'll come to them a little later, but I put that on the screen at the minute, since we're talking about the operative Masons. There are speculative Masons, a room full of women in Masonic regalia. I'm afraid the definition's not very good, but you can see clearly that they're all wearing the same sort of aprons that anyone else who's a member of the United Grand Lodge of England might be wearing. And there's a good room full of that. Was your lodge room? You'd think you had a good number in your lodge room. So they're not, of course, one lodge. It's a general meeting of them. When I talk about female Freemasons to some of my Masonic brethren, many of them seem to be unaware. And in one case, I have to say, hostile to the view that there might indeed be female Freemasons. I did come across a little hostility when I gave the general concept of this paper a little bit of an airing a little while ago. Even of the ones who do have heard that these female Freemasons do in fact exist, some of them have quite a flawed understanding of their origin and what the type of orders they exist in actually look like. On your screen there, there is a list. I try not to put too much actual text on the screen, but I thought this is the best way to do it. On the left-hand side, you have a list, short list, and it's not, these lists are not comprehensive, of women-only organizations. So we'll look women's lodges in the USA, which are chartered by the Grand Lodge of Belgium. I'll say a little more about that later, and it'll add a little bit more texture to that. The Grande Loge Féminine de France, another one, the Honorable Fraternity of Ancient Freemasons, and the Order of Women Freemasons. Those last two are the two who were congregating in the picture that I showed you a little earlier. On the other side, you have what are known as co-Masonic organizations. Now, those are organizations which allow both men and women. And I won't bore you by reading the lot. You can scan down it yourself, but you can see that there's a reasonable number. And again, it's not an exhaustive list at all, but there are a good number of organizations internationally which permit men and women to be members. I have this strange slide up because when we talk about women Freemasons and we want to go back in history, of course, nobody is arguing that the Queen of Sheba was a Freemason or indeed an operative Mason, but many of you who will have done some touring on your big OE to Europe will have seen the wonderful cathedrals in Europe, made, of course, by the medieval operative Masons. I'm thinking of Notre Dame and Rheims and Amiens, and all of those cathedrals actually have a statue to the Queen of Sheba side by side with King Solomon, because of course the whole idea of Freemasonry goes back to King Solomon. So the Masons back then were recognizing the contribution that the Queen of Sheba had, because if you're familiar with the biblical story, the Queen of Sheba visited King Solomon, and she brought him various things, and of course the cedars of Lebanon, the wood from her country would have been used in the construction of Solomon's temple, and that's something at another lecture that we might discuss a little further. That's an image of the cathedral. That's actually Amiens Cathedral in France. And that's an image of both the Queen of Sheba, somebody's imagination, of course, of the image of the Queen of Sheba, but that's the image that the Masons created on that cathedral, and other cathedrals have a similar image in their structure as well. Another woman who had some involvement in Freemasonry, though not a happy one, is said to be Queen Elizabeth I. Queen Elizabeth I knew of what was early Freemasonry in England, and she did not like it because the Queen Elizabeth lived at a time when she was very worried about the security of her throne, and she didn't like anything that was of a secret society type nature. And it's said in the history, true or false, one will have to decide that for oneself, but it's said in the history that at one point she sent some soldiers up to York to raid what was in fact a meeting of Freemasons, And within that meeting was the man to the right there, which is Sir Thomas Sackville. And the story is that Sir Thomas Sackville, when the soldiers arrived to raid the lodge, he actually persuaded some of them to join the lodge. And they went back and took a very nice report back to Queen Elizabeth as to how pleasant and nice it is to have a lodge of that sort. And she decided that she'd bigger fish to fry by fighting the Spanish. And she left Freemasonry, even if it was in a sort of embryonic stage at the time. She left it well and truly alone. Another queen who was involved in Freemasonry, and she's one, the next one is one who actually tried to enter a lodge, and that was Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. Now, she's said to have gone to a lodge and in the hope that she might be able to join it. Her husband was Emperor Francis I of Germany, and she is said to have dressed as a man to get in. And when she got there, she was tumbled as to being an imposter and was denied entry. The story is that she then sent soldiers to raid the lodge. And when the lodge was being raided, the emperor is said to have slipped out the back. Now, I've got to say, this one tests credulity a little bit because he was the emperor, for heaven's sake, and why he would feel inclined to nip out the back, I have no idea. But that's what it says when one reads the research material. So her idea of dressing as a man, and in some cases dressing as a soldier, has got a little bit of what they call in criminal circles a bit of previous, because a number of females would adopt this approach of trying to dress as men, either soldiers or otherwise. Just as an aside, I did a lecture the other evening on the Battle of Waterloo, or not Waterloo, you'll understand that if you were listening to the lecture. So at the Battle of Waterloo, when they did the survey of the dead soldiers left on the field, many of them, a good number, were women. One in particular, Mary Dixon, had served as a soldier in uniform for 16 years. An example of a female soldier from the Napoleonic times who managed to join a lodge is the one on the screen now. And her name is, as you can see from the screen, Madame, in brackets Captain, Jean Truet. She was aide-de-camp to the man to her right, General Charles Jean Truet. And she, depending on how you like to look at the story, she did use the name of Jean Truet because she was hoping to persuade him to marry her. She was in fact his mistress, but she was genuinely appointed as the aide-de-camp, and she was also appointed with a commission as a captain. If you're interested in that little bit of the story, which I won't develop, the whole story is very interesting, and the general's career and ultimate end is worth reading about as well. Well, the story here is that her proper name was Mary Henriette Heinken, and she was actually Prussian. And she went to the lodge of the Le Frère artiste, the artist, the brother artists in France, and she wanted to attend the lodge. In those days, the lodge had also attached to it what was called the Lodge of Adoption. Now, if you're not familiar with what a Lodge of Adoption is, I'll give you a brief description, but it's very well worth researching. A Lodge of Adoption was a lodge which was attached to a regular lodge and which allowed women to attend. They weren't allowed to attend the regular meeting of the lodge, but they were allowed to attend the lodge room and hold a lodge meeting under the auspices of the lodge. The proviso was there had to be a male Freemason in charge of the Lodge of Adoption. Well, she turned up at the regular lodge, and she was hoping to slip in. She was dressed, as you can see her there. It's a rather terrible picture, I must say, but however, she was dressed in her captain's uniform, and she was hovering about waiting to get in. And the regular lodge was going. She was challenged to show her Masonic certificate. And whether it was a moment of panic or what, she produced her military commission and handed it to the Tyler. And must have been a bit of a kerfuffle because he managed to let her in. And the lodge actually proceeded to initiate her into the first degree. And she's said to have actually participated in first degree work from time to time. There was, of course, a bit of a kerfuffle afterwards about how they could make such an error, given that there was a lodge of adoption which she could attend. But they thought, oh, well, the historians say, well, it was just the French attitude. They were a bit flustered and they felt that there should be some chivalry involved. And it was a chivalrous thing to allow her in. And indeed, it appears that that is what they did. There was no retribution to the people who did it. And it appears, as I said earlier, that she did participate in some first degree activities. The next slide is one dear to my heart because it's Irish. And it is, in fact, a woman in Ireland in the 18th century. And her name, depending on whether it was when she was single or when she was married, was Elizabeth St. Leger. And that's Elizabeth standing there, pointing to the volume of the Sacred Law. Now, the story with Elizabeth is that she was from, do you remember when I talked about my previous lectures, I kept referring to the Anglo-Irish ascendancy who lived in Ireland when they dispossessed the rest of us. And they lived in the big houses and they ran the land. They were in fact the landed gentry of the time. Well, Elizabeth was one of them. Her family came over to Ireland. Well, they came to England with William the Conqueror, and eventually they came to Ireland and possessed land. She possessed land in Cork, which is where my wife's from. I'm going to see if we get a bit of land back there on my wife's behalf, but I don't think I'll have much success. Anyway, she lived in the big house, which I'll show you an image of later. And the story that goes with Elizabeth is that look, you've got to realize that lodges existed before Grand Lodges existed. The Grand Lodges came afterwards. And there was a lodge meeting in her house, in her father's house. It was a lodge which I think her father had some sort of charter from London. And they were holding a meeting one evening in the house. And there had been some construction work going on in the house. I believe they were knocking down a wall to put up some sort of arch. And the wall had been roughly reconstructed in a temporary way. And the lodge meeting was happening while Elizabeth was sitting quietly in the next room reading a book. And as the evening progressed, of course, she heard some noise. And she thought to herself, I think I'll have a little look and see what the noise is. She managed to prise some of the masonry out of the wall, and she was able to have a little peep through. Now, you'll see later that other stories of this type, and this one can be proven, but other stories of this type also exist. She prized the brick out of the wall and peeped through. The noise of her prizing the brick out must have alerted the masons in the room. And I think the butler, in fact, who was employed by the family, was also a mason. And he came in to see what the noise was, found her spying on the lodge, and promptly marched her into the lodge to be confronted by the members. They had to decide what to do about her. Now, when you read this story, in some of the sort of Wikipedia type stuff, they say they had to decide if they were going to kill her. That was never going to be the case. She was the daughter of the family, for heaven's sake. So you can discount that theory, but they had to decide what to do. And they decided that the best thing to do would be to initiate her and swear her to secrecy. Well, Elizabeth took to it like a duck to water. And this also, by the way, just before I move to the next slide, this also is written up in the Ars Quator Coronatorum manuals as well, journals as well. So it's got a bit of provenance. So let's have a look at the next slide. That is a plaque in memory of Elizabeth. She's described there as Elizabeth Aldworth because that was her married name. And that's a plaque which you can go and visit in Cork if you decide to visit Ireland. And it says on it, in pious memory of the Honourable Elizabeth Aldworth, wife of Richard Aldworth of Newmarket Court, County Cork, Esquire, daughter of Arthur, 1st Viscount Doneraile, Her remains lie close to this spot. Born 1695, died 1775, so she had a good old innings. Initiated into Freemasonry in Lodge number 44 at Doneraile Court in this county, AD 17, whatever, I haven't got good glasses on, 1712, I think that says. So there's good. Now, if you look, here's a picture of Elizabeth, a portrait of Elizabeth. And if you look at her left shoulder, just above her necklace, you'll see a little pendant. And closer examination of that pendant, if we had a better picture, would show that that's a little trowel. So there's a little emblem which has got Masonic significance on Elizabeth's left breast. That's Doneraile House. So you can see it's a rather grand property. I wouldn't like to be paying for the upkeep these days, and nor would many of the landed gentry who live in Ireland. So that's a very nice property, you must admit. If we look at the next slide, you can see Elizabeth's Masonic jewel, and you can see, I never remember which is the obverse and which is the converse, but the bit on the left is the bit that has all the Masonic insignia on it, and it's the typical stuff, the all-seeing eye, the coffin, the square, the pillars. The other side, it says, the gift of Miss Stannard of Stannard's Grove to her cousin John Philpott, past master of Shamrock Lodge number 27, 1st of May 1816. That's because when Elizabeth passed away, her the medal was given to Miss Stannard, who then presented it to her cousin, who was a master of a lodge. The date on the jewel was inscribed. All of that inscription is after Elizabeth. And all of these artifacts are available for seeing when you are in Ireland. This one is her Masonic apron, and that's the apron she was wearing in the portrait. It does look, to those of us who have modernized and who've tended children, it has a slight resemblance of a nappy, but we'll not dwell on that. It was a proper Masonic apron, and above it, although you can't read it, is a description of it, and its provenance is well proven. The thing about Elizabeth is she was reported in the press at the time, well, a little later, in Limerick, which isn't too far from Cork, they're all in the same province. And the Limerick Chronicle, I think it was called, had quite a report that Elizabeth was very proud to be a Mason, and she would parade. In those days, Masons would parade through town in the regalia. They wouldn't just parade through town. They go to the theatre in the regalia at the end of the parade, and Elizabeth is said to have sat in one of the theatre boxes proudly in her Masonic regalia. She also was a big supporter. She was philanthropic, being from a wealthy family, and she was a big supporter of what was called the Masonic Orphan Girls Asylum. Now, I'm not sure whether it eventually morphed into the girls' school, but I know there is a girls' school and there's a boys' school too. My friend went to the Masonic Boys' School in Dublin, and back in the days when Elizabeth was there, she was a big supporter of funding the school for unfortunate girls who had been orphaned and whose father was a Freemason. Here's another woman who was interested in joining Freemasonry and managed to do so. This is Countess Helene Ilyona Haddock Barkowski, and she's Hungarian. Her uncle passed away, and she had access to his library, and she was ferreting through the library, and she came across books on Freemasonry, and she became quite fascinated by Freemasonry. Helene's husband was Count Bela Haddock, and he was aide-de-camp to the Archduke of Austria. As an aside, if you want to read a really interesting story, read the story of the Archduke, because he later became the Emperor of Mexico, Maximilian, and came to a sticky end, but it's not part of this story, but worth pursuing at another time if you're interested. Anyway, so Countess Helene requested to be allowed to be initiated into Freemasonry, and she was supported by the then Grand Master of the Grand Orient, a man called Ferin Poluski. He had been initiated into a lodge with a wonderful name, if you're interested in literature, was Lord Dante Alighieri. For those of you who don't know, he's the guy who wrote the Inferno. He was initiated in Turin and was in fact a 33rd degree Mason under the Scottish Rite. She was then initiated because he was a bigwig in the organization. She managed to get initiated into the lodge, but the Grand Orient took exception to it, and they demanded the return of the certificate and declared her membership null and void. She fought the decision of the Grand Lodge because she said she was quite a legalistic woman and quite smart, I think. I quite like her argument. She said, well, first of all, your constitution sucks because it doesn't mention anything about gender. She said, secondly, the law in Hungary at the time was that she was actually classed legally as a male because her father had no male offspring. And as the heir to her father's estate, legally, she was regarded as a man. She also argued that she knew a lot about Freemasonry, which was also true. And she argued that they couldn't exclude her for those reasons. The Grand Lodge argued that because she had contravened the normal processes of law of the country, that it should remain null and void. So they were forever at loggerheads, and I believe that she didn't get to any more meetings. The people involved in getting her into the lodge were slightly punished by being stood down for a while, but there was not much done. And anyway, it didn't matter because after 2 years, the lodge fell apart anyway, and in fact was dissolved. Another woman who was admitted into Freemasonry was Catherine Babington. Now, Catherine was orphaned and she went to live with her grandfather. This is in the United States. And her uncle both her uncles were Freemasons, and they used to look after the Freemasons lodge room, which was in a little room above the local schoolhouse. And she would go in to help them clean the room from time to time. And she kind of had an idea that there was something odd going on. And she was one of the women who hid herself away. There were several stories of that nature. And she hid in the pulpit of the little room because it doubled as a little church. And she hid in the pulpit during some meetings. And she managed to sit through a few meetings keeping quiet. But after a little while, her uncle tumbled to what was happening. And they took her and they decided that they would have to question her to find out how much she knew. And it was quite a lot. They swore her to secrecy. It's not clear that she was initiated. There's a possibility that she was. Her son made a bit of a song and dance about it. And indeed, if you look at the next one, you can see that a book was produced and it was produced. And you can see that there's a foreword by the previously mentioned Karen Kidd, who, as I said before, is a prolific writer in this area. And Karen does some excellent papers. So Catherine Babington was another one who was hiding and peeping into lodge rooms. I'll explain why this is such an unusual slide, because that's the best image that I can get that proves the point of what I'm saying. There are no images of Salome Anderson. And this particular report of Salome Anderson was that she was initiated into Freemasonry, and she was another one who had been hiding herself. I think she was born overseas, but she ended up going to the United States and indeed to California. And a report was published. She made it clear, which sometimes she denied it, but other times she made it clear that she had in fact been initiated in Freemasonry. And in fact, an Australian newspaper called the Colac, C-O-L-A-C, Colac Herald. I checked it. It actually exists. The Australians listening will be able to confirm that. And you can just see, if you just look at the remnant of a report that I could find, it actually mentions a prominent Mason, and it uses the pronoun she, located, etc., and it gives a date and talks about Masonic circumstances being unparalleled. So that's evidence, at least, that there was a story circulating back in the late 1800s in Australia about a woman in America who had been initiated into Freemasonry. Now, I mentioned earlier that the French have had a big connection, in the development of female Freemasonry. The more I read about this, the more admiring I am of the French's willingness to do interesting things with Freemasonry, and the creation of lodges of adoption, etc., is one of those things. This woman here, Maria Desmarais, was a very interesting person. She was we're going back to the end of the 19th century here. She was a writer. She was an advocate for the separation of state and church. She was an early women's rights campaigner, and she was initiated into a lodge called the Loge Libre Penseurs, which translates as the Lodge of Free Thinkers. It's part of the Loge Symbolique Écossais, and Écossais means they did the Scottish Rite. And after she was initiated into the lodge back at the late 1800s, she wanted to progress. She only did the first degree, and she wanted to progress. When she was initiated, the lodge that she was in detached itself a little bit briefly from the Grand Lodge, and in order that they could get the initiation done. And once she was initiated, she resigned so that they could rejoin the Grand Order. And she hoped at that stage that she could persuade them that she could more easily progress through the degrees, but that didn't happen. And for 10 years, she battled to try and get further advancement. And she was supported in her efforts by another Freemason, Dr. Georges Martin. And Dr. Martin was a great supporter of her because she was a very good social advocate and very famous during her time. And he was trying to support the idea that the French might introduce her into Freemasonry. After 10 years, they decided they'd had enough and they set up their own lodge. And this is interesting because this is where other females lodges developed from internationally. The lodge that they set up was called Le Grand Loge Symbolique Écossais de France, Le Droit Humain. And you will have seen the symbol for Le Droit Humain at the very beginning of this lecture. It wasn't a woman's lodge, it was a mixed lodge. And it was rebranded later as L'Ordre Masonique International Le Droit Humain. In other words, the Masonic Order of International Human Rights. It was called, unfortunately for Maria Desmarais, who had fought for at least 10, maybe 15 years to get advancement in Freemasonry, setting up her own lodge didn't do her a whole lot of good, because about 2 years after she set it up, she was called to the Grand Lodge above. However, she managed to get to be some form of Mason before she passed away. She was, as I said, very famous, and she was respected in a number of areas, particularly for her feminism. In this house died, usually see somebody lived here, but this is not the blue plaque that says they lived. In this house died Maria Desmarais. So that, and you can see a sort of a cartoon with her at a podium. Now, this is my favorite. I nearly said my favorite woman, but my wife might be listening. She might have prized a brick out of the wall. And she might be listening. I won't say she's my favorite woman, but I came across Annie Besant when I was studying sociology at university. And I was fascinated with her because she was an absolutely amazing woman. And you will see why. She is entirely responsible, in my opinion, for the introduction of co-masonry to the United Kingdom and to America and to other English-speaking areas as well. So, truly remarkable woman, born on the 1st of October, 1847. She was a Fabian socialist, which was a particular form of socialism. George Bernard Shaw, who I refer to in a minute, was also a member. She was a theosophist. She was a women's rights activist. She was a prolific author, 300 books and pamphlets. So a prolific author. She was born upper middle class. Her family, her father was an Englishman, but they lived at the time in Dublin because he did his medical degree at Trinity College. Her mother was Irish Catholic of a slightly lower social strata. Her cousin's a famous person as well, for those of you who are interested in British political history, because her cousin was the famous Kitty O'Shea, who had the affair with Charles Stewart Parnell, which brought the politician down. Annie herself married at a relatively early age an Anglican clergyman called Reverend Frank Besant, and that's where the name comes from. She kept the name, but the marriage didn't go too well. They had a child. The marriage didn't go too well. They couldn't divorce because he was an Anglican clergyman, and it just wasn't something he would tolerate. So they separated after 6 years, and she lost access to the child. This matters in a second. She then met another interesting person called Charles Bradlaugh, and Charles Bradlaugh was a former soldier, an atheist, an anti-monarchist, and a supporter of Irish self-rule. Together, they published a book on family planning, because poverty was such a terrible thing in those days that family planning was something that had to be confronted. And she published, along with Charles Bradlaugh, a book on family planning. Got them into big trouble. They were threatened with imprisonment. But Annie kept her head up, and she managed to ride out the storm, and she managed to get a divorce from her first husband. And she was then appointed to the school board of the London Education Committee, or whatever name it was under at the time. She made a wonderful comment at the time. She said, here I am. I think she was the head of the board, although I'm not certain of that, but she was on the board. She said, a horrible law based on religion deprived me of my child 10 years ago. And now the government has appointed me to be in charge of 360,000 London children. It's quite ironic. I paraphrase, but that was the message that she was giving. The other area in which she was very prominent was there was an interesting social phenomenon at the time. Don't worry, this leads up to a bit of more Freemasonry, but there was a very interesting social phenomenon at the time called the London Match Girl Strike. If you haven't heard about it, it's a complete shame to society at the time, and she played a very big role in resolving it. The London Match Girl Strike, I think I've got a slide here showing something. That's obviously one of the famous blue plaques commemorating that she lived in a sort of place. But the match girls were employed by a company called Bryant and May. I remember Bryant and May because my father was a smoker, and I used to lift his matchboxes, and it would have the manufacturer's name, Bryant and May. These people, Bryant and May, were Quakers, and they ran a business where they employed largely Irish labor. They employed children as well. You can see in the picture, there's a child there. And the job that they had was to take Canadian pine, thin slivers, twice the length of a standard match. And they would put like about 1,200 of these into a frame. That's what the boy has, if you look at the front of the picture. And they would put these into a frame, and they would dip them into a mixture, depending on what they were doing at the time. It would either be a mixture of white phosphorus or a mixture of red phosphorus. That's why matches had a red head at one stage. Well, this was a most horrible chemical, and it gave people something called fussy jaw, which was a massive disfigurement caused by cancer in the jaw. If they complained at the time about this, they would that they'd sore teeth, they'd be told to go and get their teeth out very quickly. Anyway, cut to the chase. Annie, these women weren't taking this lying down. They went on strike. They went to Parliament, and Annie's now partner, Charles Bradlaugh, by this stage was an MP for Northampton, and he spoke about this in the House of Commons. Queen Victoria got involved, so this is how powerful Annie Besant was. Queen Victoria got involved, and she also intervened, and the upshot of it was Bryant and May had to back down, and the conditions of employment of these poor, unfortunate people changed quite dramatically, all through the efforts of Annie Besant. So there's a plaque to her, and again, another thing showing that she was a social reformer living in a particular property. Here she is, back to a bit of co-Freemasonry. There she is now. She was instrumental in bringing co-Masonry. She went off to France along with 7 other women and got initiated into a French order. And she brought the French order back to the United Kingdom. She also did another interesting thing. Because she was involved in theosophy, she was involved in everything. For those of you who may be familiar with Madame Blavatsky, she was employed, I'm talking about Annie here, Annie Besant. She was employed by the Pall Mall Gazette to review Blavatsky's book, on spiritualism, and she got very interested in spiritualism herself. She also, just as another aside, she also was involved with another social reformer and very famous writer and playwright, George Bernard Shaw. George Bernard Shaw said that she was the finest orator in England. So that's quite a commendation. She actually asked George Bernard Shaw to come and live with her, and he declined. She then went to live with a guy called Edward Everling, and he was the guy who did the first translation. She moved in good circles. He was the guy who did the first translation into English of Karl Marx's Das Kapital. In fact, Everling liked Marx so much that he left Annie and went and lived with Karl Marx's daughter, Eleanor. Annie then, her interest moved from politics to theosophy and spiritualism, and she ended up, when Blavatsky died, as the head of the theosophy organization in England, and she represented it at the Chicago World Fair in 1893. This is a tremendous thing for a woman who grew up when she did, in the circumstances she did. She always wanted to be a Freemason, and she sought admission to the International Order of Freemasonry for Men and Women, Le Droit Humain, which I previously mentioned. And she was admitted at a meeting in Paris in 1902, along with some others. And she came back and helped to establish the first British Lodge of International Mixed Masonry. She was known as the most puissant Grand Commander. She became friendly once she set that up, Freemasonry. She became very friendly with a guy called Charles Ledbetter. Excuse me while I have a drink, if you don't mind. And he was also a theosophist, and they co-authored a book called Occult Chemistry. Now, poor old Charles was accused of impropriety with young boys, and he was offered his resignation to the Theosophical Society, and it was accepted. But Annie was appointed as head Sherang of the organization the following year, and she appointed him back because she stood with him the whole time. They then went to India, where they set up a number of organizations, including a boys' school, and she became very famous in India for the work that she was doing there. She always remained interested in her Freemasonry and her theosophy. And the Indian government issued a stamp in honor of her, and that's an image of the stamp. Google issued whatever you call that wee banner that comes up when you get Google going when you put your computer on, and that was to celebrate her 160th anniversary of her birth. Mahatma Gandhi thought she was a wonderful person, and so did Jawaharlal Nehru. She wrote a number of books. I told you she wrote 300 things on politics, on spiritualism, on the occult, and she wrote so many, 300 plus pamphlets. And she was, as I said before, entirely responsible for the establishment of co-masonry and opening the door to female Freemasonry in the United Kingdom. There was the first co-masonry convention in 1921. Just bear with me while I flick through my notes. And if you look there, you can see the Grand Master of the Order of Women Freemasons, which was founded, as it says there, in 1908. And that's their logo. And so that brings my presentation to an end. And I think that I have demonstrated in my presentation, hopefully with a little bit of humor, that women's Freemasonry was long ago established in the United Kingdom. And contrary to what some of our brethren think, it's very active and gets gets a number. There's something like 10,000 women Freemasons distributed in the English-speaking world. The other thing you need to know before closing is that the United Grand Lodge of England is now not hostile to the women's orders. It did say in its website that they recognized it, although not as a proper regular Freemasons organization, because they allow women in. It said it operated under correct Masonic procedures. It's done a few things. The relationship has become warmer. They've done a few things. For example, those of you who have been to university will be familiar with what's called the Freshers' Fairs, where lots of organizations come around the new intake of students to try and encourage them to join their organizations. And the United Grand Lodge of England has done that in conjunction with this organization in front of you. And also I believe, though if there are English Freemasons listening, they can tell me whether I'm right or wrong. I also believe that the Grand Lodge, United Grand Lodge of England, allows them to use premises from time to time. So they've made a bit of progress there. So that does conclude my presentation to you for the evening. I hope you've enjoyed it.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jack. I'll just let you get your breath back a little bit. And perhaps what we can do is stop the screen sharing so we can get rid of your slides. So just when you're ready, if you end your screen sharing, can you see where you can do that? Just
Yep. Got to it.
We should lose it. Jolly good.
There we go.
And you are now back with all of the attendees.
Yes.
And those of you who want to say something, well, by all means, unmute yourself. If you don't, well, there's no point in it. So you might as well stay quiet. Jack, thank you very much for another fact-packed presentation, which is what we've come to expect of you. I did pick up on a couple of facts, which I might have a go at you a little bit later on. But what about the rest of you? Has anybody got any comments or questions for Jack before I start?
The only organization for women that I'd ever heard of until I came here was the Eastern Star. I hadn't heard of these others.
Yes, well, I didn't include the Eastern Star because it's very well known and it's here. And I didn't include it. I'm well aware of its existence myself.
Yeah, it's not Masonic, Jack. It's not regular in the sense that its ceremonies are not Masonic, even though they had to have a Freemason for each meeting, etc. Yeah.
I'm fascinated by the Lodge of Adoption, Jack. There's no doubt about it that particularly where we are trying to encourage people who are in the Boy Scout movement to join, when I went and had a meeting with them, the girls or the ladies said, well, what about us? And I had to sort of say at that particular time, well, we don't have a direct affiliation, but there are these other things. But the idea of the Lodge of Adoptions appeals to me, and I don't know whether this could be developed, but I think it's something that I'm going to retain in the back of my mind. And with people like you to help me, we'll see what we can do.
Why do you think the animosity exists between co-masonry and Freemasonry as such, when they appear to work the same sorts of rituals that we do, but they're not divided up into as many areas?
Well, before I try to answer that, just remember what I said at the beginning. When I was planning this paper a few months ago, I did sort of bounce it off a few people, and I did meet what I would call, in one case particularly, vehement resistance to it, almost to deny that it could be such a possibility. And if it was such a possibility, it was an abomination. That's not their words, but it's mine. It was quite a bit of resistance. But why is there such, well, I've been a Freemason for 35 years, both here and in Ireland. And one of the things I have found about Freemasonry, and I'm not making a value judgment, but one of the things I found about Freemasonry is, as a rule, we're very set in our ways. And anything which steps outside the boundary is going to meet with a little bit of resistance. It's a bit like, you know, when you go to a lodge meeting and you're a visitor and they ask you to do a charge or something, and you do it, and they say, we don't do it that way here. There's that sort of approach.
The only reason I say that is that the Heritage Society in Auckland had the Co-Masons along, and the animosity was quite pronounced, and yet the people are good people. And you know, that's what I suppose disturbs me more than anything.
Yeah. I can't really account for it except to say we're set in our ways. And other than that, your guess is as good as mine, Graham.
Yeah, well, I'd like to see a lot of women join, especially some young ones, you know, because if they get their kid off, it's good for us all.
I think, Graham,
we might have to mute you, Graham, if you go any further.
can I just answer Graham's point? The animosity is not a Masonic characteristic. It's a characteristic of the individual, and it comes from their ego. Lots of people have been brought up by other people telling them that we don't recognize Lady Masons, and so they believe it without question. And then when somebody asks them, they say, we don't believe in Lady Masons. The Grand Lodge of England refused to accept Lady Masons' lodges as regular. And that's as far as they went. They didn't say they didn't believe in them or they banned them or anything, but they just simply refused to accept them as regular Masons. And the photograph that Jack showed wouldn't have been in a lodge room. That would have been, actually I recognize it. It's one of the dining rooms in the Connaught rooms. And that's one of the things that the Grand Lodge of England used to adhere to. And that was Masonic lodges, lodge rooms were not to be used by anybody who was not in amity with the Grand Lodge. So the Lady Masons would meet in the refectory area rather than in the actual lodge room. And this actually happened in our lodge complex in south of England, where I was.
Can I respond to that? I'm not so sure, George, that you're right about there being no institutional animosity, because my understanding is that in the past and probably currently, a Freemason who attends a non-regular meeting, and I think we take an oath on this, who attends a non-regular meeting, either co-masonry or whatever, is likely to be drummed out of the organization.
Yeah, but that's not necessarily animosity. The word animosity carries with it certain rather dark overtones in my dictionary.
Well, we can use a synonym. We can say that there is distaste and dislike for non-regular Masonic orders such as co-masonry. It's certainly not welcomed with open arms, though it is good to see that there is some cooperation now. I mentioned particularly the Freshers' Fairs.
Yeah,
Jack, I have a question for you, but it's not to do with tonight's paper.
That's unfortunate, Gary.
Well, it's more because of your Irish background. I've been doing a lot of research lately on lodge regalia, and I'm interested to know what the significance is of the Master Mason's dressed apron.
Well, this is my study I'm sitting in, and I have several bits and pieces of regalia, both New Zealand and Irish, in the room. One actually sitting just across the way there. You bear with me for a minute. That's my Irish. That's my Irish Master Mason's apron.
What's the significance of it?
The same significance as your New Zealand Masonic Mason.
Yes, but not all. A lot of study that I've done shows that as a dressed apron, not as a Master Mason's apron.
No, that's a Master Mason's apron, and that was given.
Why in the Irish Constitution does it show two aprons like that? One with only one lot of blue round it and no silver.
Yeah. And
the other one, like you show there, with two lots of blue and the silver, and some of them have got gold in it.
Yeah, I can't account for it, Gary. I'm sorry, I can't help with that because my lodge In Belfast, everybody wore an apron that looked like that. You'll
Right.
also notice, if you look at the tassels, you'll see that they're not chains with a little dandy little ball. There actually are silk tassels. It's just, I just can't account, if there are two different ones, I can't account for why they are.
And the other interesting thing that I noticed about them was that a lot of Master Masons' aprons in the Irish Constitution don't have the tassels and balls. The two blue ribbons finish in a triangle.
That's also true. That's also true.
Why is that?
I'm afraid I can't help you. They didn't consult me on it. I've no idea.
Sorry to put you on the spot, Jack, but it's just been intriguing me.
But now that you've asked me, Gary, I'm in contact, of course, with members of my lodge back home, because I brought some of them into the lodge, and they're now in quite senior positions. So I will be asking them the very question when I meet you in refectory, hopefully not too distant future. I will enlighten you as to the answer to your questions.
Well, that would be very interesting to see, because the regalia salespeople in Ireland show both aprons, the one that you show and the one that we wear here as a Master Mason's apron.
Yeah.
Harry, I think quite a bit of this reflects the individual lodge. Some individual lodges have their number on their apron, for example, or they think that a past master should have something slightly different. You know, the Scottish lodges wear a sash and it'll have the name and the number of the lodge, and some have this tartan and some of that tartan. But, you know, some of it also reflects the manufacturer. I don't know if you've noticed, I've noticed this with English Master Masons aprons. They are much more colourful now than they used to be. They used to be a much, in fact, the Irish one still is, but a much paler light blue. A Cambridge blue, if I put it that way. But what's happening now with modern materials is they're much more brilliant color that are being offered. And the manufacturers have done it. Nobody's ordered it. It's just happens.
But,
Just before we go on, I'll just show you. I don't know if you can read that. I'll hold it up there. I probably can't. But when I left my lodge to come to New Zealand, they presented me with a new apron, which is this one. And they have it embossed on the inside, and it says on it, presented to brother, they call me John there, brother John Dowds from Shaftesbury Lodge number 327 on the occasion of his departure to New Zealand, May 1990. So I'll always know when I came to New Zealand when I look at the back of my apron.
well,
Jack, can I ask you how many tassels that apron has? Or the threads on each side?
7.
No,
I'll have to count
it's
them.
more than that.
It's more than 7. That's 3, 4, 5.
It seems like 9 or 15.
7. Oh, it's more than that. I'm up to 7 already. 8. I think it'll be 12, 9, 10. Oh no, there's more. 11, 12, 13, 14.
14 on each side, right?
On each, same on the other side. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So that is Irish apron, right?
Yeah.
There is one exposed in UGLE Museum that we've been discussing on Saperiau, and no one believed that there is any apron that has more than 7 tassels. So I just noticed that it's not a fake photo that they shared, but you definitely have it more than there. So thank you so much. So
you're welcome.
I was thinking about the innovation in masonry, that if women were admitted into the lodges that we know, the thing is that there isn't any international governing body of the Freemasons, and so at the moment, if we keep it the way we are, we have people come from America or Britain or South Africa or wherever, and they join a New Zealand lodge because we're in fraternal communication with their lodge. But the problem is, if anyone steps slightly out of line, and not even as much as the radical thing of involving women in our lodges, they would be excommunicated from the idea of being able to freely go between the different constitutions. And this, so that the lack of an international governing body does mean that everybody treads very, very lightly. And I think the wording of the English recognition of the women's Masons probably is as far as they can go without losing everybody else.
Yeah, but it was
Interesting, Jeffrey. You should look. People should have a look at what it says on the website. If I could just say, when I did raise this at the early stages of writing the paper, the two things which stick in my mind, other than the sort of very harsh resistance, was, and they may have been joking when they said this to me. One guy said to me, "I don't want women in the lodge. I come here to get away from women, and I want just men." Another guy said to me, and this may be more true, "I don't want women in the lodge because my wife wouldn't be very happy at me coming to lodge meetings with women in it." So all various reasons.
I think one of the interesting things about the women's order in England is that they still call themselves the worshipful master, and it's a fraternity.
And brother, they say brother too.
Brother.
Yeah.
Have a grand master. They do everything exactly the same as the men, exactly the same ritual, regalia. The only difference is when the initiate first comes into the lodge, they do not expose their left breast. Because they don't need to prove they're not a woman, they are a woman. David, sorry, I know you keep trying to get a question in, don't you, David Slater?
No, I was just going to comment there. I mean, the fact that people may not want women into their own lodge is fine, because they can always keep them out if they have a ballot. That's no reason why women should not be accepted. And I think what you said there, or what I said before, whereas you're worried about being recognised by other jurisdictions, that's going to hold everyone back. Once someone starts doing it, it'll happen. It'd go, I think. But that's what I asked a question of our Grand Master decades ago now, and that was the answer. He gave. If we do it, we won't be acknowledged. But someone's got to make the first step, and they'll have to one day. I mean, every other organisation which was male only, or just about every other organisation, is accepted that women are equal and can join it. We're a bit of a stick in the mud as far as that's concerned, in my opinion.
Can I just put in a spoke there? It's very interesting what you say, but if any of you are Lions, and I've been one, I was one in 1991, and I'm still one, when an edict came out from America that women were to join, and they told us that it'd be the biggest boom out that you'd ever see, because we'd have access to 50% more members. Well, in the first 5 years, they lost 393 clubs worldwide, and Lions is now just a social club. I mean, the women have been huge in it because they've taken over. They want to run it. They are district governors. But the special feature of Lions was the male working bees, the male bondage, and the various things that we did. We can't do that now, or we don't do that now. It's more of a social, it's just another social club, and they've lost something. Worldwide, they've got less than 1.5 million members when they had 2 times or 3 times that, because that's not what men want. And all the clubs I know are declining at the same rate as Freemasons are. So there's no benefit to it as far as the club goes. And the same would happen with Freemasonry, because there's a special thing for men's clubs and a special thing for women's clubs. And not everybody wants to mix. And it's nothing to do with the way people feel. It's the way things are. And we just like sometimes to go to men's organizations. Women like to go to their organization.
Well, in support of what you said, I'm glad the door was closed, because my wife's a very active Lion.
They are.
I'll have to tell her you get up to male bondage, but we'll pass over quickly on that one. And my wife was her Lions Club originally was actually male and female, and now it's entirely female, for the reason that you say, Peter. The women actually want to have their own Lions Club. It's not a Lionesses club. It's a Lions Club entirely female.
Yeah. But we've had more district governors, women, than men, because the men don't want to do that. They just want to go to working bees. They just want to bond a bit. They just want to have to do the things men do. And the women are very keen on running things. Well, We all know that, don't we? We could say that. but you
Check
know
the
what
door-
I'm saying.
Check the door again.
We changed the complete. We changed Freemasonry completely. If we.
Losing it.
Well, you know, Peter, UGLE has realized very quickly that it needs to have women involved for the simple reason that when they started the university scheme and they went to, and you mentioned this, Jack, with Freshers Week and so on, and they wanted to attract young men in the universities, they were completely rejected by the universities and by the men as well, saying you are a sexist organization and we do not want you on campus. But what they have found, the UGLE have found, is that if they go along with one of the two women's Grand Lodges, they're acceptable. And the women are getting probably more recruits from our university scheme than we are.
Jack, just one point. Your paper topic is Freemasons, the female of the species. Given our current situation in the world today, how does the forum feel through you in relation to the fact any one of us could go and have a sex change operation and be sitting in a male lodge as a female?
I don't have a view on it. Perhaps someone else might.
What you're trying to say here, Kerry, is that UGLE has announced that if a male member decides that he is now a woman and undergoes sex change, etc., he is still acceptable as a male Mason.
Correct.
And the Lady Masons, the two orders, from what I understand, have basically said, well, she's not welcome here.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Kerry, we live in challenging times as far as these things are concerned.
We certainly do.
I think that male masonry, actually going through the chairs and in the traditional way, I mean, people, it's a bit short-circuited these days because of our lack of membership. But if you take 10 years to get to the master's chair, you have to do a number of things that women would actually rescue you from doing, such as in the hospitality part of it, the stewarding and so on, and taking minutes even. I know that on committees I've been on, quite often we can't, the women end up making the tea and things like that because that's what they do. We can't stop them. And I think, they're often to the kitchen before we see them doing it. And so I think that I felt going right through the chairs that I was learning things that I would never have had the opportunity of having to do or be left on my own to actually do if women were there, because they would rescue me quite often.
Yeah, I've got a view of how we deal with ladies in Freemasonry as well. And I'm afraid it's not a very nice one. You've got to bear in mind the age distribution of our order, and we're all at the upper end of the distribution. That's where we're weighted in that direction. Now, I've gone along to countless meetings, and we talk about the ladies. And we have the ladies sitting for an hour outside when we do our meeting, and they eventually come in and pour the tea, etc. Well, see, my wife wouldn't do that. My wife's a university lecturer, and she's a very independent woman. And the thought of her being stuck outside, sitting, waiting for us to finish to allow her to come in to make a cup of tea and a sandwich for us, it would just be I'm speaking on her behalf. I've never discussed it with her, but I'm imagining that's what her view would be. I think in this modern day, those days have gone when we can do that, and I'm sure younger women would not like to be in that situation.
This talk about whether we should allow women into Freemasonry is actually irrelevant, because the two women's Grand Lodges don't want men. They don't want to join with the men. They don't want men to come into their orders. You can get a little bit confused. I'll have a talk with you actually, Jack. You got a little confused between your HFAF and your OWF, and with your pictures and things, and it's very easy to get them confused, but there is a cool amity between them, shall I say. One was a breakaway from the other after about 5 years, and that was 100 years ago. And they
Yep.
never managed to come back together again.
No, I'm aware of that. I wasn't sure which slide is that you're talking about.
Well, you know where you had, right at the beginning, you say they were all together. I don't think they were all together.
Oh, the beginning slide. Yeah.
No, but there's two sides. That was actually Christine Chapman's mob, the HFAF, the one
Yes.
that broke away. And at the
Yeah.
end, where you had the badge, you had
Yeah.
the badge of the HFAF, but the picture is the OWF. That was Zuzanka, the Grandmaster Order of Women Freemasons.
Yeah. The image on the right was not meant to be attached to the image on the left.
No, but they don't like to be mixed up. You
All right,
know?
fair dues.
I have a question, if I may.
Alan, yeah.
My experience, I used to be involved in JCs when it was very strong back in the, and that was fine when we were all young marrieds and things, and the wives were quite happy for the fellows to go out and build playgrounds and do things on a Saturday morning, have a few beers afterwards. Once Femme Souls started being introduced to the group, the organisation died very quickly. Let's go to the 90s. I was involved very much in Rotary. My wife was involved in Zonta. I enjoyed going along to Zonta. Once a year they had a meeting which the other gender were invited to. Once a year, and that was it. But once we allowed the Femme Souls and the career women into Zonta and put down the role of the Rotarians, whatever, I think Zonta fell away. And that was really when I started concentrating on Freemasonry as a direct result of what happened in Rotary. That's just a personal experience. And certainly, I agree with Jack. My wife's not the slightest bit interested in coming along to meetings where she's got to wait for an hour and a half while we have an installation.
Exactly.
She will come along because I really wanted to come along certain high days and holy days, but doesn't enjoy it.
No, a lot don't, to be honest. John Mitchell, you had your hand up. You wanted to say something, didn't you?
Yeah, you know, on this idea that Peter was saying about men only club, as a teacher and having taught at girls' school when I first came out of the RAF, and then at a boys' school, and then at co-ed, I can tell you that the sense of humour in an all-boys school is totally different to any time you put females in that group. And I think that's why men like to go to a men's only club. The younger generation are totally different. They've been almost browbeat into losing their sense of humour. And that's where I think some of that animosity comes from, is from us, we want to be with guys. No sexual connotation at all.
Two people have mentioned.
Yeah, what?
Lawrence, one is JC's wife.
Right, Gary, you're talking to somebody else. What they say in America about Freemasonry, the Freemasons say, is that they are one of the few organizations that are providing role models for young men. And there's a great lack of role models for young men today. And so many schools, education dominated by women, many things are dominated by women, and they feel that's a real issue. But Graham, you were wanting to say something, weren't you? Graham Norton.
You think just we have a situation in Auckland where we had a past master of a regular lodge, and said person has had the operations and is now 100% a woman. And technically can't belong, but is still a Freemason.
Great. Okay, we've got time for two more, and two have put their hands up, Bob Wright and David Chichinadze. Bob, do you want to kick off? You're on silent, Bob. Unmute yourself. Bob, unmute yourself.
Hit the space bar.
Okay, there we are.
You're on.
I'm going to share my screen. Yeah, okay, I'm going to share my screen.
No, you can't.
No, you can't.
Okay,
You can't.
right, sorry. Okay, then, oh, it's all right. It doesn't. It's not relevant then.
Oh, right. Okay.
Save the fact that I saw an interesting presentation by the Welsh provincial Grand Master, and the at the tail end, most of the story was presented by a lady wearing a Grand Treasurer's jewel, and spoke about Freemasonry in her regalia.
Interesting. David Chichinazzi, do you want to have the last word?
Yes, thank you so much. In many forums, when the discussion goes regarding the topic, whether the women should be accepted to Freemasonry, whether they're regular or not regular, it all ends up in looking at the topic from a legal point of view about the rights, legal rights, and or traditionally it hasn't been the case, so why should it change now? We prefer to be kind of separate. Many arguments, but it's kind of revolves around the legal dimension. My question is to Jack, whether do you think that there might be some esoteric or spiritual aspect to having these two sexes or genders separate in their rituals?
I can't see what the spiritual element of keeping them separate would be. I thought if we're looking at the spiritual side of it, you've got bringing them together. I'm not advocating them together, by the way, but I'm being devil's advocate here. Bringing them together would be a symbiotic situation as far as the spirituality is concerned. I can't see why it would be different keeping them separate.
Okay.
Okay.
Now,
actually, just a comment, Brother Julian Rees, you may know him, but he was part of UGLE, high-ranking official, and he then moved to Lumen in few years ago. And actually, last time we had the discussion with him, or he was invited to Scottish Constitution in South Africa, online talks. But we went into this dimension, and he said that the spiritual experience during the ritual with women present kind of increases like 80% plus. Just that comes from the practitioner, just to let you know.
Julian Rees is one of the organizers of what's called the Lunch Timers. This is a group that meet in a pub nearest to Great Queen Street headquarters, the Duke of Wellington, I think it is, and anybody that calls themselves a Freemason can go to it. So there's women, there's co-masons, there's some men, and so on, and they can all mix and mingle and all be friends. And Julian, of course, was very upset by what our Deputy Grand Master said at a communications one time, that in Freemasonry we don't do spirituality, and that really set, that really set him off, and he headed off towards co-masonry in a big huff. But anyway, now tonight, Jack, if he had been actually traveling, would have been in Rotorua at my research lodge, and what would have happened now is I would have leaned on everybody to buy a copy of his book, The Ramble Around the Pillars. And if you've enjoyed his talk, and we are getting some really good talks, this is only one of 8 which are in the book. So if you would like to purchase this book, unfortunately, we're not here physically for you to do it, but we have sent stocks to all of the research lodges, all of the hosts, the 12 locations that are involved in Jack's New Zealand tour. You can get them from them. If you have any difficulty, you can contact me or Jack, and we can send them to you. The difference is you'll pay the postage if you do it through us, whereas you won't pay the postage if you do it through your local research lodge. That really is it. On Thursday, we have another talk from Jack, which I'm very much looking forward to, when he would have been at the Wellington Lodge of Research, and I hope that we'll have a lot of people coming in from then. So unless there is anything else, George, have we covered?
Can I put out a little teaser for that one, Mike? The title of it is Solomon, Symbolism and Sex. So there's a little bit of a teaser. Your imaginations can run wild as you wait in anticipation of the big reveal.
Absolutely right. And in fact, it's Solomon, Symbols and Sex, a ramble around the pillars, which is where you got the title for your talk from. I'm certainly looking forward to it. It will be at 7 o'clock on Thursday, this coming Thursday, the same link that you had tonight for them all, which is hosted by George Allen, and you can get through to that. So unless there is anything,
we just asked people to log in around about 10 to 7 instead of about 10 past.
Yes. It actually went very well tonight, so that was good. So
That's a matter of opinion.
So thank you all once again for coming, and we look forward to seeing you on Thursday. So good night.
Can I give an apology for Thursday, because at 7 o'clock, as the district grand almoner, I'm hosting the district's almoners in a Zoom meeting.
We're missing you already, Roger.
Mike, before you push the big red button, could you and George and me and maybe David, I'd like to iron out these problems that we're having at the beginning, because it's incredibly frustrating.
We'll do that tomorrow. Okay. Do you want to do it tomorrow with you and me, or whatever? We'll see. If you want to stay on, you can do. But otherwise, good night, everybody, and we'll see you next time. Good night.
Good night. Good night.
Thank you for
So
coming.
should I stay? You said, Jack.
Good night,
You want
everybody.
me to stay?
Just hang on, David.
Yeah, let's just see who stays. Yeah.
Let everybody else log off first.
Thank you. See you, David. They've gone.
See you, brother Mike.
Is Mike gone? Yeah.
David Slater. No, it's just Slater was going. And who else have we got?
David, greetings. Actually, David will be hosting David tomorrow.
Don Ray. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Who's Calvin? Jolly good. See you next time, Don. All the best. Kelvin? Are you still there, Kelvin?
I'll log in off.
You can actually, or no, George can
I've just
actually remove. Oh, okay.
Jolly good. Right.
Okay, now I was on the cusp of the evening when we were going through that. I was saying, guys, let's pull the plug, because it's incredibly frustrating.
What is?
Trying to get up and running.
Well,
and it's for just let me finish, George.
It's basically,
I'm not complaining.
it's
I'm trying to be
basically
practical.
because I've
Let
been
me
through.
finish. George,
Let me stop the recording.